Victor huffed in irritation as he watched the latest news on television about a recent sex scandal involving a high-ranking general and his assistant, a married lady with two small children. The next report showed the disgraced general telling reporters that his action was morally wrong. He looked gloomy and much thinner than in early photographs of him with his assistant, now also known as his mistress. It's funny how they all wring their hands and say a few words of apology only after they've been caught. He told his wife, to whom he was married for more than 30 years. He glanced at Vanessa as he said this. They sat in their living room as they always did after dinner to watch the news, which had become their habit over the years. It became a way for them to spend quiet evenings together, especially during the years when their children were growing up in free time for themselves. Was a rarity. Now both of their children, James and Karen, were adults and had their own families. James was 30 years old and worked as an electrical engineer. A few years ago, he married his childhood sweetheart and they had a 3-year-old daughter. Karen, who was 28, married a work colleague and they had a 2-year-old son. Victor himself was 59 years old and Vanessa was a couple of years younger. She has always been passionate about fitness, and it shows in her toned 5'8" inches body with ample breasts and a round butt that still turns heads. Of course, time and gravity have left their mark, but only slightly. Her brown hair had turned slightly gray, matching her green eyes and cheerful face perfectly. And according to Victor, his wife was a real beauty and a hot grandmother. One look at her caused pleasant excitement in him. He was not yet 60, but daily walks with Vanessa and yoga classes kept his equipment in tip-top shape. Some of his colleagues already suffered from high blood pressure and elevated sugar levels, but he was lucky. At 6 feet tall with silver hair and blue eyes, he looked more like a successful CEO than a retired technocrat. Victor looked at Vanessa tenderly. Her favorite series was about to start, and he moved closer to her, placing his hand on her thigh. He knew his wife well. A little affection during her favorite show always turned her on. He might be lucky today. Probably like any couple of adults, they never thought they'd get caught. Vanessa replied, brushing back a strand of her neatly styled brown hair without taking her eyes off the TV. Victor turned back to the TV. A retired military man spoke on the screen, telling how difficult constant business trips abroad are. Men are away from their families for months at a time, and men, as we know, remain men. He then added that the general, who was at the center of a scandal for putting his tool in the wrong place, had served 6 overseas tours in the last 10 years. It was clear from his tone that that same married assistant to the general was his only entertainment on the cold and harsh front. Do you think the absence of loved ones and the loss of their company can be considered a sufficient and justified reason for betrayal? Victor asked. He was sure his wife would tense for a moment and then relax. He gently stroked her thigh, and he was almost sure that he felt this tension, but he could not exactly say why. She was silent for a couple of minutes, as if considering the answer, and then said, "We live in a society where same-sex marriage is no longer condemned. Couples are in open relationships, and cohabitation is not even discussed. In short, it all depends on the people themselves. It would be wrong for anyone, including ours, to pass judgment on matters that concern only our personal lives." Victor considered his wife's. It seemed vague to him. She seemed to answer, but in reality she didn't. By people, did she mean only the man and woman involved in the affair, or also their relationships with their spouses? Did she mean that it's okay to cheat if a couple is unhappy in their marriage and lacks interaction with the opposite sex? Victor didn't have time to think about that answer because Vanessa shifted position and her legs parted slightly, inviting him into action. Victor immediately moved. His hand slid to her underwear and he felt the warmth emanating from her body. The series she had been waiting for had already begun, and Vanessa was completely absorbed in the plot. With his hand on her panties, Victor cupped her left breast through her nightie and began kissing her breasts. Vanessa responded by pulling his head closer to her chest and running her fingers through his hair. This surprised Victor because she usually only reached this level of excitement towards the end of the series. Vanessa and Victor sat together on the couch, immersed in watching the series. Their intimacy intensified as they began to gently caress each other, gradually moving away from the screen. Victor touched her, running his hand along her thigh, and Vanessa in turn hugged him, expressing her affection. Their interaction became more sensual, but did not cross the boundaries of intimacy. Vanessa looked at Victor. Their eyes met, and she whispered to him about her desire. This was an unexpected moment for both of them, since they usually waited for privacy, but now everything seemed natural. Victor removed his clothes, and being next to her, gently touched her shoulders. Their hugs became even warmer, and they continued to enjoy the moment, forgetting about the series. The next morning, Victor left early for the office of his former company. He stepped down as vice president of a couple of years ago. The company didn't want to let him go. He worked there for more than 20 years, starting as an engineer at a construction site and gradually climbing the career ladder. But Victor was adamant. He discussed the issue with Vanessa before bringing it up at work. As their children got jobs and started families, both decided they needed more personal time to spend more time with their extended family. In a couple of years, Vanessa was also planning to retire. They agreed that Victor would remain with the company as a consultant. The idea appealed to him as he could continue to stay current in the construction industry, and his former company could benefit from his extensive experience. By agreement, Victor visited the office 2 or 3 times a week unless anything important arose. This gave him plenty of free time to pursue hobbies, such as golf. Vanessa, in turn, held a senior position in the finance department of a company that operated a chain of retail stores throughout the state. She had worked for the company for the past 10 years, ever since they moved from Dallas to Houston when Victor was promoted and had to move to the headquarters. In fact, it was her hard work at her previous company in Dallas and a thank you note from her old boss, Harry Woolman, that got her the new job. Harry knew the owners of the chain store well, and when they decided to move to Houston, he contacted them and helped Vanessa get the position. Both were grateful to him for this. In Dallas, Vanessa got a job at Harry's company when Karen started school and worked there for almost 14 years before they moved to Houston. The decision to move was not difficult for them, since by that time the children had already graduated from school and left for college. Given her long tenure with the company, Harry did everything he could to get her a new job. Sometimes Victor recalled fondly the years he spent in Dallas. Both of their children were born and raised there, and sometimes he wished they had stayed there after they retired. But Vanessa wasn't keen on the idea. As she explained, from Houston they were closer to their children and grandchildren, and this was more important than nostalgic memories of the past. Living in the present, not in the past, is her motto. Victor saw no reason to argue with this, and with the offer of consulting work, the solution seemed not bad at all. That evening, more updates appeared on the evening news about the fallen general and his mistress. Judging by the flurry of media interest, it seemed like it was the best press event since the tragic death of Princess Diana. According to the presenter, the woman involved in the scandal told her friends that she regretted the harm she caused to her family and others because of her affair. You know what's strange? Victor said to his wife as she handed him a glass of wine. She says she regrets the pain she caused her family, but never mentions that she regrets the affair itself. How can a woman or man be so ambitious and career-focused? Didn't she ever think that she was betraying the trust her husband had placed in her? How can you be sure that this affair was only for the sake of career and glamour? Vanessa replied softly, taking a sip of her wine. Victor was stunned by this answer. He looked sharply at his wife, who continued to stare at the TV screen. This woman is not some inexperienced girl of 20-something years old, but a completely mature 40-year-old woman. Are you saying that she deliberately decided to cheat on her husband? Do you think that she allowed herself to develop feelings that should have been reserved only for her husband and threw herself into the arms of another man, ignoring even her children and the possible consequences for their upbringing? Victor asked incredulously. By that time, the news was showing old footage of a woman doing push-ups with the man who was interviewing her. This was filmed around the time the mistress published a book about her lover, a biography of the general. Of course, at that time, the world did not yet know that the general and the writer slept together when they were not discussing the book. Victor, men and women think differently, tried to understand what I mean. If you ask women about their most cherished memories, most of them will talk about a picnic or lunch in a cafe on a rainy day. And a man will most likely remember the positions in which they had sex after returning home from the cafe. They were silent for a while as Victor tried to understand what his wife was trying to explain to him. Vanessa then continued, they spent many months, if not years, together while she was writing the biography, and most likely, some kind of connection gradually developed between them, a kind of unity of two minds. And the bodies too, Victor added caustically. He felt like his wife was justifying the couple's actions. And the bodies too, Victor added sarcastically. He felt like his wife was justifying the couple's actions. Vanessa pursed her lips at his sarcastic remark and continued to calmly stare at the TV screen. This man is old enough to be a grandfather to her young children. At the very least, he should have shown maturity, the same maturity that our leaders saw in him, who entrusted him with such important foreign assignments, and not allow mutual infatuation to cross acceptable boundaries. Victor continued in the tone in which he usually reprimanded his subordinates. Oh, if only the heart could think and behave as rationally as the mind. It was a romance between two hearts fully realized and completed, Vanessa whispered. Victor was dumbfounded. He couldn't believe what he had just heard from his wife. The way she reasoned reminded him of one of the episodes of her tearful TV series. For the sake of his family and young children, for that matter, I hope her husband takes the betrayal the same way you do, he replied sharply, and now it happened again. He felt her muscles tighten again as if she was sitting a little straighter. Perhaps he shouldn't have spoken so harshly, Victor thought. They seemed to instinctively stand on opposite sides of the barricades. He found himself on the side of the devoted husband, while Vanessa seemed to sympathize with the unfaithful wife. Victor took the remote control and changed the channel. Over the next few days, Victor was unable to follow the news about the general and his married mistress. He and Vanessa were expecting their children and grandchildren to arrive for Thanksgiving, and Vanessa gave him a long list of things to do. It was necessary to buy gifts for the kids, who seemed to be in constant contact with their grandmother through their parents' phones. It was also necessary to carefully remove the precious china into the attic. The idea was to free up the living room for the grandchildren to run around without breaking anything valuable. Victor was so busy preparing that he decided to skip his golf game, a small detail that soon changed his whole life. He spent the day wrapping the expensive dishes in soft fabrics and old newspapers before putting everything in cardboard boxes and storing them in the attic. He then began moving other fragile items from the living room to the garage. He didn't hear the doorbell the first time because he was busy in the garage. When he returned to the house, the courier was already pressing the bell almost continuously. Victor quickly looked around and headed towards the door. "Are you the Browns?" the courier asked casually, rolling the chewing gum in his mouth. "A package for you," he added, handing Victor the paper to sign. "These young guys these days have absolutely no manners," Victor grumbled, slamming the door. He placed the box on the kitchen table and looked to see who it was from. His name was written on the box, V. Brown, and the sender was listed as a Dallas law firm. The fact that the package came from their old town piqued his curiosity. Perhaps if he had not been so busy, he would have noticed that the initials V. Brown can also mean Vanessa Brown. Maybe then he would have waited for her to return from work and let her open the package herself. But everything happened differently. Victor took a kitchen knife and cut the packing tape. The sound of Vanessa's car arriving broke the eerie silence that had reigned in the Brown house for the past few hours. Then a car door slam was heard. Moments later, Vanessa entered the house through the garage door. "Hey, darling, I'm home," she called, setting out her shopping bags and laptop bag. "Wow, someone was very busy here today," she continued in a cheerful tone, looking around the mess in the living room. "Darling, come down. I'll make us some coffee," Vanessa said, heading to the kitchen. She was not at all surprised that her husband still had not answered. What do we have here?" Victor heard her He looked down at the copy of the letter he had held in his almost numb hands. Just recently they were shaking so much that he could barely hold the paper. Victor squeezed it in his fingers as if his life depended on it. He carefully folded the contents of the parcel as they were, with her lover's letter on top. He knew Vanessa was reading it now. Victor put on his glasses and began reading the letter again, knowing that his wife was doing the same. My dear lovely Petunia, if you are reading this letter, it means that my time in this world has come to an end and the Lord has called me to his heavenly kingdom. First of all, please, don't mourn for me. I am an old man over 70, or rather, I am a lonely old man who was never able to recover after Martha left this world. Her passing literally took away my joy in life. As you know, she was my childhood sweetheart, and we got married when I was 20, and she was 19. She was with me through good times and bad for almost 40 years until illness slowly took her away. We knew that the end was near, but we still clung to each other until the last, enjoying every moment, until the time came for her to leave. So like I said, don't mourn for me. It's time to reunite with my girlfriend. My children have already settled down in life, and even my grandchildren are ready to leave their parents' nest. So, my dear sweet Petunia, say goodbye to this old codger with a smile. If there is life after death, I will find my Martha again. As for you, my dear, if it weren't for your love and care in those terrible days after her death, I would have left this world long ago. Don't argue. I know it's true and you know it too. You took care of me like a mother takes care of her child, warming me with your warmth and love. Your affection and our closeness became a magic elixir for me. You know, I have always had tender feelings for you, despite our age difference. Whether it was at work or when I watched you at children's birthday parties, you always reminded me of those days when my children were little, and Martha and I were so busy with them. Your special touches and whispers, which you may have talked about with the girls in the office, were always intended only for you. I only said things like that to others, to avoid giving myself away. And as it turned out, it worked, since each of you considered me just an old joker. Have you ever wondered what the symbol of femininity, a circle with a cross, means? Well, let me explain. The circle represents spirit and the cross represents matter. And you, my dear Vanessa, are the embodiment of femininity. You healed my mortally wounded soul, gave it a meaning for life. If Martha was watching me now as I wrote this last letter to you, I'm sure she would completely agree. And as for the physical intimacy you shared with me, it was amazing. You were always so lively, full of energy, and of course, with little tricky things. Even the Playboy girls could learn a thing or two from you. In short, you are the standard of femininity, both in spirit and in body. May God bless you with happiness and good health for every moment of your life. You love children, and I hope that the Lord will send you even more of these sweet babies. Well, my lovely Petunia, it is quite difficult for me to put on paper all my eternal gratitude to you. Let me move on to the main reasons for this letter. You probably already understood the first one by looking at the stack of photographs and discs included in this package. Yes, you guessed it right. These are memories of our time together. Forgive me for this, perhaps inappropriate voyeurism, but you know me too well and may have already suspected it, although you have never spoken about it. I installed cameras in both my office and my home, but don't worry, I never shared these memories with anyone, not even with the ladies I befriended, at your request, and you know about them. Now that I am on the verge of death, I could not burn these memories. I'm sending them to you. Please keep them close to your heart, just like I do. And now the second reason. Honey, my lawyers will be contacting you shortly regarding a check for $2 million made out to your name. Remember that trip to Miami for a couple of days? We went out to sea and spent time completely naked under the open blue sky. This is a trip that was worth taking my camera on. We snorkeled naked and then spent the entire day lounging on the deck making love. Then they cooked dinner, got drunk, and made love again in the cabins. These were wonderful moments we spent together. You may remember that on the last day we went to an art gallery and you chose a few paintings. Well, my lovely Petunia, they are now valued at about $2 million, and I don't think I should pass them on to my children. I have instructed my lawyers to sell them and transfer the proceeds to you. If you want, you can send them your bank account details, and they will transfer them to you. Well, I think I said everything I wanted to say. My dear lovely Petunia, once again I wish you all the best in life. Take care of yourself. Forever your devotee, Peach. The letter slipped from his exhausted fingers and smoothly fell at his feet. It left no room for guesswork. His wife of over 30 years was having an affair with her boss in Dallas, and he never suspected that anything was wrong. I remembered an incident from the distant past. Harry and Martha were known to be partygoers and often hosted them at their home. Like all the previous ones, this one also went off with a bang. It was already late, and Victor began to look for his wife, who it seemed to him had too much to drink, so that he could take her home without any problems. She was neither in the living room nor in the kitchen. He went out onto the terrace and froze. Vanessa was in the far dark corner with Harry. He grabbed her around the waist and pulled her towards him. He leaned towards her and seemed to whisper something in her ear. Vanessa, as far as Victor could tell, didn't mind the intimacy. She had a smile on her face. Due to the darkness and distance, Victor couldn't be sure, but it seemed to him that Harry was moving his hips, as if simulating sexual intercourse. He didn't like it at all. He seemed to hit something with his foot, and upon hearing the noise, Harry immediately retreated to a more respectful distance. Victor approached them and spoke, as if he had not noticed anything suspicious. His wife, as he noticed, blushed a little, and it was clearly not from drinking. Later in the car, he shared his suspicions with her and asked for an explanation. Although she didn't deny anything outright, she brushed off his concerns by saying that Harry was like that with all girls, especially after a couple of drinks. Respect to Martha, but look at her and you'll understand why he has so much fun at parties. His wife said that night with a mischievous smile. That evening they made passionate love, and by morning Victor had forgotten all his doubts. Until that moment, Victor remembered Martha. She always wore her hair short and probably looked very similar in figure and style to the wife of that general who was now in the news for unheroic reasons. During his service, he, of course, did not catch famous terrorists, but he definitely caught something else, much more juicy. Just like Harry caught his wife. Victor picked up his smartphone and began looking through the photos he had scanned and downloaded to his laptop and phone. The pictures showed them doing this in the office. Harry didn't have a longer one than his. They had been to nudist camps, and Vanessa had once jokingly compared it to the ones the others had had. Then she seemed satisfied, but now Victor doubted that maybe she had always wanted something more. Maybe now he'll ask her. Although that doesn't matter anymore. Her preferences were obvious in the photographs. In one of the pictures, Harry sat in his office chair without pants or underpants, while Vanessa pleasured him. In the next photo, her blouse and bra were hiked up. The next photo disgusted him. Victor zoomed in on his smartphone and noticed the date on the desk calendar almost 6 months after Martha's death, and a year before they moved to Houston. Martha had liver cancer. Constant parties and excesses eventually took their toll. The diagnosis was made too late and the cancer was at the last stage. She died 6 months later. Martha's death changed Harry a lot. As far as Victor remembered, after her death, they no longer went to Harry's parties, but by that time he had already begun an affair with Vanessa. He no longer needed parties to dry shake his wife. They continued to have sex for almost a whole year, and Victor did not suspect anything. His chest tightened with pain and bitterness rose in his burling throat. He turned out to be a cuckold like that doctor in the scandal with the general. What is this general's wife thinking now, Victor thought. She was publicly humiliated by the very man for whom she sacrificed herself and their family. For more than 30 years, she supported him in the shadows, encouraging him to take on the most difficult tasks for the good of the nation, knowing full well that she and their family would have to cope with the difficulties. What is she thinking about now? Victor asked himself again, as if the answers to his own pain and humiliation depended on her thoughts and actions. She was in the same age category as him, and at their age, people dream of a quiet retirement life of grandchildren and sunsets with their spouse. The last thing you think about at that age is about adultery and its consequences, about pain and humiliation. The general's wife served her family selflessly, and this affected her appearance. She clearly could not compete with the young mother of two, who is still enjoying her postpartum glow and beauty. And this cuckold, what does he think Victor continued to think? The woman's husband may have believed that his wife was traveling all over the world to complete the biography of one of the nation's greatest soldiers. But now it turned out that she was being nailed in different parts of the globe. Victor smiled bitterly at the fact that he was not alone in his hour of betrayal and pain. Before he could reach the bathroom, he heard soft footsteps approaching his office. Victor wiped away his tears and tried to suppress the onset of nausea. Yes, he was a cuckold, but he wasn't going to let his cheating wife see the humiliation on his face. He put on his glasses and bravely turned towards the door. The door opened silently, and Vanessa walked in on tiptoe. She stopped, looking at him silently. Victor looked back at her, trying his best not to blink or show tears. The bitterness was still in his throat. He could smell its acrid smell. He took a deep breath and slowly counted to 10 before speaking. The package was addressed to W. Brown and came from Dallas, so I mistakenly assumed it was for me. He said in as even a voice as possible. She was crying. Her makeup was completely smeared across her face, creating tear tracks, and her neat hair looked disheveled, as if she had just gotten out of bed and walked straight into the office. She nodded her head and sat down on the only chair opposite him. Victor continued to look at her. She glanced at him every now and then again looked at the wall behind his shoulder, as if some important hieroglyphs were hidden there that could help them get out of this situation. What should I say to my wife, with whom I have lived for more than 30 years? What should a grown man, almost 60 years old, say to his wife who cheated on him? Together they saw life in all its manifestations with its surprises, ups and downs. He was old and was not destined to live forever. This is the law of nature. The next generation, their grandchildren, have already come into this world to continue their lineage when they become just memories. And now how do you face your grandchildren's grandmother? How to demand an explanation for the insult and humiliation caused? Why did she kill him without killing him? Victor, this may seem banal, but everything is not as you think. She began nervously and then fell silent as if the words had run out. Not what he thinks, that's it. A grown woman in her 40s, married, deceives her husband. Her family breaks her commitments and now says it's not what he thinks in her defense. This lasted not just one night, but almost a whole year. In one of the videos on the disc, his wife was dressed in a Playboy bunny costume with a tight corset and only a bright red thong, covering her womanhood. Victor watched them copulate for several minutes before turning away in shame and humiliation. But Harry was still in business. The old man had stamina, that's for sure. Victor had never felt so humiliated and depressed, and perhaps it showed on his face, because he noticed how Vanessa shrank in her chair, as if she felt deep guilt for something he could never imagine. At least that doctor from the news didn't have discs of his wife having sex with the mice. General Victor thought bitterly. Images of his wife dressed in a bunny costume, her eyes wide with pleasure, and her ample breasts could not leave his mind. These images did not leave Victor's head, as if they were repeated over and over again on the screen of his consciousness. There were other clips, just as candid, filmed from different angles, where his wife was in the most intimate situations. Old trickster Harry was a master not only in business, but also in filming, his dirty film. Victor wondered if the general recorded his meetings with his mistress the same way Harry did. It didn't matter anyway. All that mattered now was that his wife was part of something he could never have imagined. She destroyed everything. It wasn't on purpose. It wasn't planned. Vanessa tried to speak again, as if she was looking for a way to justify herself. To her husband. Harry was in a terrible state after Martha died. He was completely broken by her. Leaving, she continued, as if Victor was not clear what was happening. Victor just nodded. Of course, everyone knew that Martha's death had destroyed Harry. However, this still did not explain how exactly his wife became involved in these obscene scenes. After her death, Harry lost himself. In the office, we saw him sitting at his desk, not touching the papers we left for him. He just stared into space. We tried to support him, to do everything we could to bring him back to life, but nothing helped. Then he was prescribed sedatives to at least somehow help him. Vanessa continued looking down at her hands. but it didn't bring him back to life. He was still not with us. At one point, the senior members of the company held a meeting with him and agreed that someone from the office would accompany him to important client meetings to keep him in shape, she explained, pausing for a moment to watch her husband's reaction. Victor nodded again, although his face was completely expressionless. He already knew where this was leading. I was appointed his assistant, Vanessa said quietly, and something like a challenge mixed with despair flashed in her eyes. I did everything I could to help Harry get things done. I had to communicate with the heads of all departments to prepare him for each meeting. I learned more about the workings of the company than ever before, and gradually Harry began to regain his interest in the business. We became a team. I accompanied him to all his meetings, even those outside the city, she continued, as if apologizing for all those work trips. Victor listened to her, but not with the same interest with which he began this conversation. These all sounded like excuses that she might have been preparing in her head as she walked home. Everything was clear to him. She explained how her role in the office had gradually grown into something more, but there was no real accountability for her actions and her words. At some point, I became his unofficial chief advisor, Vanessa said with pride in her voice, and Victor saw her face light up for a moment with memories. Business started to recover, and I felt like I was really saving the day. I even made sure he took his medication. His complete dependence on me became obvious to everyone, she added with some complacency. Victor looked at her and felt his anger begin to rise again. That self-satisfaction, that sense of accomplishment, it literally oozed from her words. Her pride in how she had saved Harry and his business was mixed with the fact that she had betrayed him, her husband. You became his mistress, Victor finally said with a sarcastic smile, unable to resist. Vanessa recoiled as if she had been struck. Her face flushed red and her eyes sparkled with anger. "Don't you dare call me that!" she hissed through her teeth, clenching her hands into fists. "Mistress, lovely Petunia, whatever it is called, the essence is the same," Victor answered with cold calm. "You make excuses for me, but you just like to think that you were indispensable in his life. You saved him, didn't you? That's what made you important, but in the end you were just his toy." These words struck her. She again tried to say something, but Victor interrupted her. "Go on, I'm interested. You haven't yet told how your meetings began. As I said, Harry has more or less become dependent on me. From the moment he came into the office to the time he left, he was with me. It also helped me improve my negotiation skills through observing Harry and also through the advice he gave me from time to time." Vanessa paused as if collecting her thoughts. "Now the real story begins," Victor thought gloomily, but he was still a lost-of-birth soul. Sometimes when we were having dinner at a hotel restaurant during our business trips to clients, he would look at the couples sitting next to him with a kind of thoughtful but sad expression on his face. And one day when we were slow dancing, we got close and he rubbed himself against me. I realized that he was excited. I looked at him confusedly and realized that he was looking at a very cute couple on the other side of the hall. There was a short silence. Victor saw that his wife was gathering the will to continue. "Continue," he said dryly. "Well, when we got back to my room, I invited him for one last drink. And that's how it all started," she finished, again refusing to look her husband in the eyes. By this point, his feeling of betrayal and humiliation had given way to anger. If what he heard was true, then it was at that moment that they began their affair. They, of course, were in no hurry to get into bed, Victor thought, glaring at his wife. As he recalled, the general and his mistress also sang the same song that nothing happened while they were traveling around the world. And everything began only after they returned home. "So you slept. No, more precisely, you made love that night for the first time," Victor said with obvious sarcasm in his voice. No, Victor. I didn't make love to Harry. The Lord knows that I love only you and no one else." She exclaimed in response. It was healing of mind and body. Victor began to feel uneasy. His wife's answers made him feel as if he had never really known his wife in more than 30 years of marriage. They say that a man can never fully understand a woman. Only now did he begin to realize the full essence of this thought. As he understood it, she was going to say next that they slept together that night, and that at the very least was sex. And considering that this lasted almost a year, it was already closer to the concept of making love, since in such cases there are usually feelings. But his wife, who heads the accounting department of a large division and has more than 50 years of life experience, seemed to be in denial. What were they doing in the hotel room then? Played the fool. After a couple of drinks and talking about everything, under the sun but nothing in particular, I leaned over and kissed him on the lips. At first he was surprised, but then he answered. After a few kisses and caresses, I unbuttoned my blouse and let it fall to the floor along with my bra. "What?" Victor shouted. "Please, Victor, I'm trying to be honest with you," Vanessa whispered. Fresh tears had already begun to flow down her pale face. Harry was everywhere. He pinned me to the bed and started playing with my breasts, caressing them, kissing them, and all the time admiring my beauty. It was funny, hearing him admire me, and it turned me on too. Then he reached for my skirt, but I stopped his hand. Instead, I unzipped his pants and gave him pleasure. Here it is finally. His wife finally revealed how her affair began. Did the general's romance with his mistress also begin innocently? We were discussing the project of his biography, and one day we just put the book aside and started having sex. He wondered what kind of story her mistress was telling her husband now. He would like to know what stories the general's mistress might have told her husband while their secret remained unknown. Now that it was all out, it seemed that the family she had spurned for the general's more embrace and bed was the only one that had provided her with refuge in her moments of national, if not international, shame and humiliation. The next morning, Harry greeted me at breakfast as a completely new, renewed man, much more like the Harry I knew before. We didn't talk about what happened last night, but it weighed heavily on my conscience. Seeing his beaming face and the sparkle in his eyes made me feel like I made the right decision last night. "The right decision," Victor repeated sarcastically. "Of course it never occurred to you to talk to me about this before you accepted it. Or perhaps you assumed that I would warmly support your way of reviving your boss." Vanessa gave her husband a strange look and continued. "The next few days at the office were uneventful. Harry had changed for the better, and I felt happy. We continued to work closely and have lunch together in his office. And then one afternoon when I came to see him, he asked me to close the door and come to him. When I approached, I saw that he had taken off his trousers and underpants. He sat completely naked from the waist down. He looked at me with the same look that I saw from him that evening in the restaurant. And I suddenly realized that I was unbuttoning my blouse and kneeling in front of him. It became almost a daily routine. I just couldn't refuse him. Couldn't refuse. Victor repeated this with disbelief. "Victor, this man survived a terrible tragedy." Vanessa answered with irritation. "This is not my wife. This is not the woman I married," Victor whispered to himself. "But in those photos and videos, you were doing much more than just pleasing your boss," he added. "Victor, I apologize for the pain and suffering that I caused you. The footage must have been terrifying to watch. Oh God, if only I knew." Vanessa fell silent, remorse and anguish written on her face. Tears were already flowing down her cheeks again, leaving new wet marks. Victor looked at his crying wife with a cold gaze. The torment seemed real. Over 30 years of marriage, they learned to understand each other. But why? Why did she decide to change? Was he not enough for her? Couldn't he satisfy her? He knew he didn't always please her, but that was normal for most women. Or did she just want something different after all? These years, something on the side that she could remember in the future. After all, many years ago, she clearly looked with interest at those men on the nudist beach. His wife was a smart woman, and what she said did not add up to the whole picture. "So for the record, when did you two finally start cuckolding me in the fullest sense of the word?" Victor asked sharply. Vanessa flinched when she heard his words. She started to say something, then stopped. Then she spoke again, all the while looking at the floor. By this time, Harry and I were having almost daily lunch, meetings in private. Since I was assigned as his assistant, the company did not see anything strange in our spending lunchtime together. And Harry, let me tell you, by this point, he had completely returned to his previous style of communication and behavior. There was no longer that Harry with slumped shoulders, walking straight into his office, not noticing anyone around. Victor couldn't help but notice the hint of pride in her voice when she said those words. We were at one of the meetings with clients out of town. Harry was in great shape, and the meeting was a success. That evening we decided to have a little party for ourselves. We drank a lot and danced. In general, we had fun. Harry was at the top of his game and never missed a chance to pet me on the dance floor. Then he leaned towards me and whispered that we should go up to my room for the last glass. Well, I knew what he really meant, and since we were already doing this regularly, I agreed. We left the restaurant and headed to the elevator. Entering the room, I went to the bathroom. When I returned, Harry was already completely undressed and lying on the bed. I joined, Vanessa whispered. Oh yes, I joined, thought Victor. The bile rose in his throat again, threatening to destroy the mask of calm that he had so carefully demonstrated and clung to. The images he had seen on the recording flashed through his head again. She gave pleasure to him, and he to her. In another scene in Harry's living room, he roughly grabbed her and ordered her to take off her clothes. She obediently obeyed. It was obvious that she liked it when he dominated her, when he forced her to do what he wanted. He then told her to go with him to the pool, where he ordered her to kneel. She walked out into the street in high heels, completely naked, her buttocks swaying seductively from side to side. It was a nice ass, and Victor loved it. Looks like Harry does too. As Victor continued to watch the disc, his wife unzipped Harry's trousers. She unfastened them and put her hand into his underwear. Harry sighed in surprise, but that was not all. Their performance did not end there. Harry looked at Victor's wife with an astonished expression. Martha would kill me if I did that. This phrase was probably one of the most disgusting words Victor had ever heard in his life. This man praised his mistress while humiliating his dead wife. Even more disgusting was the way his naked wife smiled lovingly back at Harry, literally beaming with happiness at his compliments. Then he heard his wife say, "I have made you happy. Now I want to have the same pleasure." He greedily pleasured his assistant. Her next words were forever imprinted in Victor's memory when he saw his wife say, "Please have sex with me now." Victor looked at the screen with tears in his eyes as his wife began to have sex with her lover. They had sex for quite a long time in different positions. They remained entwined for several minutes until Harry rolled to the side. Vanessa immediately snuggled up to him, resting her head on his shoulder. He began to gently stroke her hair, whispering to her about how wonderful she was. They continued talking in low voices until they fell asleep, hugging each other. Yes, Vanessa, you did join him in the living room by the pool, and of course in his bedroom too, Victor thought darkly, looking at his wife. Vanessa's eyes widened in shock, and she covered her mouth with her hand, a look of shame and humiliation on her face. "Forgive me, Victor, I'm sorry that you—" "Tell me, Vanessa," Victor interrupted her. "As far as I remember those years, you didn't go on business trips very often. But from what was captured on the video footage, the two of you just couldn't keep their hands off each other. So all your adultery took place at his house, as shown on these damn discs." Vanessa winced when she heard the word adultery. At least she still had enough decency to be embarrassed, Victor thought. She spoke again. This time her face was turned to the side and she still did not dare meet his gaze. We stayed at his house alone. His son served in the army and was overseas, and his daughter moved to New York. Harry often left work early and no one was surprised. Then I left earlier, allegedly bringing papers for him to sign on the way home. Since I was his assigned assistant, it did not raise suspicions, Vanessa said, the last words, barely an audible whisper. Yes, you're right. It never occurred to me to ask why you stop at his place so often on the way home. And when I was transferred to Houston, the way for your betrayals was absolutely clear. How naive I was, Victor answered through gritted teeth. Vanessa continued to avoid his gaze, although her flushed face and heavy breathing clearly showed that his questions and sarcastic remarks made her very nervous. Vanessa didn't answer. Instead, she continued to look at her hands in her lap. Victor, trying to cope with the surging feelings, asked the following question. Why did you do this? We were losing him. After Martha died, he seemed to have lost all will to live. He was lonely and lost, like a lamb lost in the forest. Tell me, Victor, was it wrong to save a man from death? You're a married woman and you slept with your boss. Victor answered angrily. It seemed to him that he did not know his wife at Dal. Victor, suppose you end. And that big busty Mrs. Anderson who lives on our street got lost in a snowstorm and ended up in some old wooden house. And to keep warm, you hugged each other and maybe had sex. Would that mean you cheated on me? What kind of explanation is this, Vanessa? Victor roared. They seemed to speak different languages, and each ignored the other's words. The point is that I loved and loved only you, Victor, and what happened between me and Harry was just sex. Sex to save the man we all knew from the world of the living dead. I don't care whether your lover lives or dies. These feelings and emotions should have been dedicated to me, and only me. If sex were some kind of therapeutic agent as you present it, then all the nurses and hospitals would practice it with enthusiasm. Victor exploded. With these words, Victor left the room with a roar. He was overcome with anger and resentment. He quickly gathered his things for the night in the bedroom and headed to the guest room, throwing a couple of pillows on the bed. Vanessa remained in the living room, silently looking at the closed door behind, her face pale with shock. This night turned out to be sleepless for Victor. A confrontation with his wife over her affair revealed stunning facts to him that he had not even suspected. He recognized a new side of her personality that made him uneasy. Throughout their argument, she continued to insist that this was not an affair in the usual sense of the word, but something like therapy, an attempt to save a person from his internal destruction. And at the same time, she claimed that Victor had always been and remains her true love. What nonsense! Or was this a new way to justify his betrayal? Victor turned over on the bed and closed his eyes, but the thoughts in his head did not decrease. I remembered how the general and his mistress also tried to hide their relationship until their secret was revealed, and they became a general disgrace. Isn't that what Vanessa did? If he had not opened that damn package with photos and a disc, he would never have found out about her betrayal. Perhaps in this case, their family life would have continued, and he would have lived his life in ignorance like a fool. Vanessa knocked on the guest room door. "Have you taken your medications?" she asked quietly. Victor chuckled contemptuously, without turning to the door. Her concern for his medications seemed especially absurd to him now. He could, of course, take care of himself. She knocked a couple more times, but Victor did not answer, and soon everything became quiet. A slight feeling of guilt began to gnaw at him from the inside. His wife always took care of his health, and a small voice inside him reproached him for such childish behavior. He turned over on his other side but could not fall asleep. Thank God that the children grew up and left long ago, was one of the last thoughts that flashed through his head before sleep finally had mercy and covered him. They spent the next few days avoiding each other as if they were afraid to resume their conversation. Victor was still trying to process the realization that his wife had cheated on him. But what was even more depressing was that for her, this was not cheating in the usual sense. She believed that she had done what she had to do, and now everything should return to normal. Thanksgiving was approaching, and children and grandchildren were soon to arrive. There was still a lot of preparation to be done, and they both decided not to bring up the subject until the children had left. Victor went about his daily activities, communicating with his wife as little as possible. Vanessa seemed to understand his silence and distance, but her eyes were red and wet most of the time, and her face took on a sickly pale hue. Several times Victor noticed how she looked at him, furtively, and of course, they no longer watched TV together after dinner as they used to. This was probably the first real sign of the consequences of her long-standing betrayal. Vanessa noticed this too, because when Victor went to the guest room, she remained in the kitchen, with a glass of wine, often lingering there for a long time. Victor increasingly wondered how the deceived doctor and his unfaithful wife, who were discussed in the news, now lived. Do they now sleep in separate rooms like he and Vanessa, after the whole world learned that the general took his place in their marital bed? The day before the children arrived, Vanessa begged Victor to return to the shared bedroom. Victor at first refused, but then still gave in. He didn't want his humiliation and cuckling story to become the property of their adult children and their families. Nothing good would come of this. Finally, the children arrived home, and for a while all the bitterness was forgotten or put aside. Victor had not seen his children for almost 6 months, and it was nice to see them again. And it was even more pleasant to watch the grandchildren running around the house. Karen was the first to notice the change in her mother. It's amazing how daughters sense any changes in their mother's moods and behavior. "Mom, you're somehow not the same as usual. I hope you don't miss your medical examinations," she asked with concern in her voice. Karen always had a caring side and couldn't help but notice the tense atmosphere. "Hey, Dad, I hope you and Mom aren't acting like little kids and fighting over little things," she added jokingly. But Vanessa straightened up abruptly, as if she had been electrocuted, and stared at her daughter's back like a hunted animal. "Look, this is the same cuckold and the general's mistress," James suddenly shouted. All this time he was immersed in the TV and did not really listen to his sister's conversation. Now it was Victor's turn to be shocked. Before this, no one in their house except himself had uttered this horned word. Hearing his own son shout him out, Victor lost his composure for a few moments. He turned around sharply and saw his son watching the news. On TV, they showed the same doctor whose wife cheated with the general. The television showed the doctor and his unfaithful wife walking together along the gravel path outside their friend's house, where they planned to spend Thanksgiving. The woman was wearing dark glasses with the collar of her coat raised, clearly trying to hide from the cold wind and intrusive cameras. Victor remembered seeing her earlier on the same news channel in much more fashionable outfits. Now the fine wrinkles around her mouth were clearly visible, and it seemed like she was a different person. Getting caught cheating in front of the whole world is no fun. Victor glanced at Vanessa from under his eyebrows. She stood in the same place where she had been a few seconds ago, as if paralyzed. Her face turned white, and the pain in her chest that Victor had experienced in recent days reappeared as soon as painful images of his wife's betrayal, captured in photographs and discs sent to Harry as a parting gift, appeared before his. Why? Why the hell? Why did she cheat on her family? Didn't she understand that once she took her marriage vows and entered into married life, her life was no longer hers alone, just as my life was hers? Why, Lord? He thought bitterly. But it seemed she was not the only such woman. This lady from the television screen was clearly her companion at the club. That woman's husband was so different in appearance from the charismatic and daring general. The doctor was a professional. He saved lives, and this was reflected in his appearance and behavior. It's a pity that his wife preferred the soldiers, one of whom, as it turned out, she led into her family, causing collateral damage that forever changed the lives of 2 small children who did not even suspect that adults were so shamelessly playing with their destinies. "Oh, these kids are so cute," Karen gushed, channeling her maternal instincts. One look at this pathetic cuckold is enough for the whole world to understand why his wife traded him for the general. James suddenly commented, still completely engrossed in the news. "James, we don't know the whole story. Perhaps she felt that the general entrusted with the responsibility of spreading the ideals of the free world in a wild and underdeveloped part of the planet needed the support of a close friend, since he was so far from his family. Perhaps someone would say that the doctor should not be offended by this, and he should continue his happy life." Victor tried to object, carefully observing his wife's "a happy life? Nonsense. This doctor has already been humiliated enough. The woman is very ambitious, and I'm sure this is not the first or last time she has spread her legs to get what time she wants. If the doctor is smart, he will break up with her as soon as possible and start his life anew. Of course he needs to take the children, because there is not a drop of goodness in this woman's soul. While she slept with her lover around the world, he took care of the children, and his meant, "No, sir, she's a bad woman, and he should break off relations with her as soon as all this media fuss dies down. But first, he should check the children's DNA." James finished angrily. "My thoughts are exactly the same," Victor thought, glancing briefly at Vanessa. She still stood, motionless, holding tightly to the back of the chair, as if her life depended on it. Perhaps she was shocked by her son's harsh words. Her eyes started from one family member to another. Perhaps she had feelings for the general during the long years of their close communication. She is certainly a strong and ambitious woman, as can be seen from her school and military achievements, which the press so carefully brought to light for their dear readers. Perhaps she saw her ideal man in the general, Karen suggested. Her words seemed to Victor to be consonant with Vanessa's thoughts. Do all women think this way, he thought. No way, Karen, said Janet, James' wife, who had just joined them after checking on the kids. She was married and had her own family. Even if she had some feelings for another man, she should not have crossed that invisible line. She selfishly destroyed the trust and faith that her family had entrusted to her. In this sense, she has already left her family and moved on to a personal life in which there's little room for her husband and children. The family must also move on, Janet concluded. Well done, Victor thought. At least one woman in the house saw things differently. James was lucky he had an intelligent and sensible wife. Now opinions are divided, 2 against 1. Victor looked at Vanessa again. Well, dear, what do you say? Was it an affair that should have ended as Karen thinks? Or should it have remained just a passion of the heart, as Janet believes? All eyes in the room turned to her. She stood there with her eyes wide open, her lips trembling and her mouth open, as if she could not utter a word. Her appearance was that of a hunted animal, driven into a corner with guns pointed at it. Just leave them alone, she finally screamed, stunning everyone present. Tears flowed from her eyes again, irreversibly washing away the makeup from her face. What difference does it make what they do or don't do? She continued in a trembling voice. Vanessa was shaking all over, and the dim light in the room cast ominous shadows on her face. Mother, Karen exclaimed, rushing towards her in fear, but Vanessa raised her hand, gesturing to stop, and quickly left the room, leaving everyone in a daze. Karen's husband, Dave, entered the room from the terrace. He was on the phone the whole time and missed the family drama. Hey, I heard loud voices. What's going on here? He asked in surprise.
Nothing, Dave. I hope it's nothing, Karen replied quietly, still looking at the door through which her mother had come out. She clearly felt that something was wrong. Then she glanced at her father, with a silent question in her eyes. Victor made an indifferent expression and shrugged. The next day, no one remembered either the general and his mistress or the nervous breakdown that Vanessa seemed to have had. The children and their families said goodbye and left in the afternoon, leaving Victor alone with Vanessa again. At another time, they might have been in the bathroom, completely naked, sharing a glass of wine. But now there were only awkward questions and further denials between them. Now that the house was empty again, Victor and Vanessa were left alone with each other. But there was a gap between them that was difficult to bridge. Vanessa looked exhausted. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, and her face took on a sickly pallor. Less than 2 weeks had passed since receiving that damn package with photos and a disc, but it seemed that she had aged several years. Victor also felt broken, although he tried to hold on. He didn't have much to do, so he decided to pull out a bottle of whiskey from the cabinet, which he had long been saving for a special occasion. He poured himself a large glass and began to drink slowly, losing himself in his thoughts. By the end of the day, the bottle was almost empty, and Victor, sitting on the sofa, stared blankly at the TV screen, not paying attention to what was being shown. Vanessa sat in the other corner of the room with a dark and judgmental expression on her face, but did not say anything. Victor didn't care about her opinion. She didn't ask his permission when she cheated with Harry, so why should she now tell him how to live? The TV again showed news about the general's mistress. Vanessa carefully watched the broadcast, trying to divert the topic in another direction, but Victor, although he was drunk, was not going to remain silent. Why did she cover her head with a scarf? He muttered, looking at the screen, which showed a woman among the locals in some distant Asian country. In some countries, women are expected to cover their heads out of respect for tradition. Vanessa answered carefully, happy that he was at least talking to her. Why did she have sex with the general there? Is this also part of their cultural traditions? Victor grinned roughly, looking at his wife. If only I knew all the answers to your questions, Vanessa replied quietly, after a pause. And tell me, what kind of social norms of our great country made you use your body to help your boss get over his grief? Victor shouted drunkenly, breaking into a scream. The pain of betrayal was clear in his voice. Vanessa's eyes opened wide and tears began to flow down her red cheeks. Again, Victor, I am very sorry for the pain and suffering that I caused you. If I had the opportunity to turn back time, I would fix everything. But Victor, we need to move on, and I know that we can do it. By this point, Vanessa was already on her knees in front of him, her hands resting on his knees, and her eyes pleading with him. Move on, Wee. What is it that lies ahead that makes you so damn optimistic? Victor muttered dully, still feeling angry despite his alcoholic intoxication. Darling, we have lived together all our lives. We have 2 wonderful children, proof of our mutual love, and our grandchildren, too. It is as if we planted a small sapling, took care of it, watered it, fertilized it, and now this tree has grown tall and strong, bearing fruits. The fruits of our labors. Think about everything that lies ahead. In a sense, our lives are just beginning. Yes, some of my past actions may have hurt you greatly, but Victor, imagine that I fell into bad company and became a drug addict. Wouldn't you try to hold me and help me cope so we could move on? Victor's alcoholic consciousness had difficulty processing her words. What would he do if his wife became an addict? Would he yell at her, angry? Or would he still try to help her overcome her addiction? She may be trying to imply that she had some other addiction, sex, novelty, or was she just looking for something new after all these years? These thoughts were confused in his head. So you admit that you are horny and addicted to sex, Victor said coldly. How many men have you had besides me and this Harry? Victor, there has never been another man in my life except you. Vanessa answered sharply, her voice sounding firm. And I'm not addicted to sex. You know me well enough and should have thought before throwing such cheap accusations at me. She continued, a hint of anger appearing in her voice. That's the problem, Victor replied. The photos show you having sex with your boss. You yourself admit that you had an affair with him. But at the same time, you claim that I was the only man in your life. Victor, I simply used my body to help a person in need. I deserve better understanding than the one you give me. Her voice trembled with pent-up emotions. I think I need to get some fresh air, Victor said wearily. He stood up swaying and walked to the guest room where he fell face down on the bed. The next morning, Victor woke up early with a severe headache. He felt bad and remembered that he had eaten almost nothing in the evening. He was surprised to see that Vanessa had fallen asleep in the chair next to his bed. Memories of yesterday's quarrel came flooding back again, and he felt even worse. He really needed some fresh air, some time alone to think and sort out his thoughts. He looked again at his sleeping wife. The empty glass on the table next to her chair indicated that she was under the influence of sleeping pills and would most likely sleep for some time. Victor quietly packed his things into a bag and left the house, deciding to spend a few days at their house on the lake. He really needed to be alone. He left a note in the kitchen for Vanessa and told her where he would be at noon. Victor saw Victor turn his SUV off the dirt road and follow a barely visible path that led him to their secluded hut in the forest. The bustle of the city has long been left behind. The lake was only half an hour's walk along a forest path from their hut, and Victor planned to go down soon. But first, he unloaded the provisions he had bought along the way at the gas station. Over the next few days, he planned to get the place in order before winter arrived, and hopefully he will also get some of the answers he was looking for. An hour later, Victor walked purposefully along a forest path. The air was fresh and cool, and the sun was shining in the sky, playing hide and seek among the few clouds that could be seen scattered here and there. His long steps continued to bring him closer to the lake, although his thoughts were far, far away. Back in Dallas, Harry also had a cabin in the woods. Images of Harry having sex with his wife in the cabin flashed through his mind over and over again. They had sex under the open blue sky, without a care or concern. The CD showed the two running out naked, laughing and giggling like 2 teenagers. Harry tried to grab his wife's naked ass from behind as she playfully tried to resist him. This brought him back to the question whose answer continued to elude him. Was his marriage annulled, or should he forgive his wife's infidelity and see if they have some kind of future together? After all, they have been married for almost 30 years, and anyone can make the wrong choice or decision. When he looked back in time, he really couldn't say he was ever unhappy with his marriage. Like all couples, They too had their ups and downs. But that's always to be expected when two people start living under the same roof. Marriages may be made in heaven, but it was the duty of mortal earthlings to make them work. What if he had an affair? What would Vanessa do? Forgive him, or did you take it to the dry cleaner? A shiver ran through his body as he walked along the shore of the lake. He was so engrossed in his thoughts that he noticed the frisbee flying towards him until it bounced off his left shoulder. Victor looked up in fear. He saw a young guy rushing towards him with an apologetic expression on his face. Behind him, he saw a woman and a teenage girl looking in their direction. It was clear from their appearance that they were all one family. "Sorry, mister. One flew past me," the blonde said. By this time, mother and daughter had also joined them. The boy definitely followed his mother. He had the same clear blue, twinkling eyes as his mother. The girl, no doubt his sister, seemed a year or two younger to him. "It's okay, son. I should have been more careful. It's no big deal anyway," he replied with a smile and threw the frisbee in his direction. Victor looked at his mother, who was waiting for him while her children ran for the frisbee. She was blonde and had blue eyes like her son. At 5 feet 8 inches tall, she had a well-proportioned body. She looked at him, and her eyes seemed to actually smile at him. Judging by her son's age, he guessed she was about 40, but she looked no older than 35. Overall, a very good package. He noticed that her husband didn't seem to be around. "Hi, I'm Paula Lehman," she said as he approached her. "Victor," he answered with recognition. Up close, she looked even sweeter and more comfortable. "Please accept our apologies by sharing a cup of hot coffee and homemade cookies with us," she continued as they both began walking along the Pride shoreline in the general direction the children had gone. Victor agreed to the invitation, and they slowly walked towards the blanket, where a basket and a thermos of coffee were laid out. On the shore, the children were still playing, laughing, and running after each other. Paula seemed to enjoy watching them, and Victor couldn't help but wonder how long it had been since he and Vanessa had also enjoyed moments like this with their own children. The conversation with Paula was easy. She said that her son Frank was 16 years old, and her daughter Beth was 13. Paula's husband was a chemist who died several years ago in a factory accident. Paula worked as a psychologist, and her family went to the lake this weekend to take a break from city life. Victor felt sincere sympathy for this family. They were clearly friendly and supported each other, despite the loss. The children joined them for coffee and cookies, showing good manners and consideration for their guests. Victor talked a little about himself, about his grandchildren, and suddenly caught himself thinking that he had not felt so calm for a long time. Their conversation flowed naturally, and he began to feel some relief from his worries. Paula clearly cared about her children, and their respectful and warm interactions only reinforced the feeling that they truly were a strong family. Victor was pleased to be among them. His own wounds temporarily healed in their company. As the day began to fade, Victor realized that it was time for the Lehman family to return to their rented house, located not far from their lake. Paula invited him to visit them again, and he, thanking her for her hospitality and delicious cookies, said goodbye to her and the children, heading back to his secluded hut. As Victor walked along the path back to the house, his mobile phone emitted a short signal, reminding him of a new message. It was a text from Vanessa. "Miss you," she wrote, and then added a reminder for him to remember to take his pills. Yes, I miss you too, Victor thought, although he could not get rid of the heavy feeling. Sometimes he regretted that he had not opened that ill-fated parcel. Then he would not have found out about her betrayal, and perhaps would have continued to live in blissful ignorance like a simple and naive person. But now that he knew the truth, it was increasingly difficult for him to understand how to live on. He returned to the cabin, quickly prepared dinner, and sat in front of the TV just to keep himself occupied. However, thoughts about his marriage and what happened to Vanessa continued to torment him. He remembered his daughter Karen calling him recently and clearly noticing that something was wrong. "Hi, Dad," she said when he picked up the phone. "Mom said that you went to the lake. Why didn't she go with you?" Her voice sounded wary, as if she suspected something. Victor explained that he just wanted to get the house in order before winter and be alone for a while. But her next question confused him a little. "Dad, is everything okay between you and Mom? You're acting strange." You could hear the concern in her voice. Victor then honestly answered, "Baby, don't worry about Mom and me. I can't promise that everything will be the same, but I'm really trying to figure things out. I have questions, and I'm trying to find answers." He changed the subject so as not to disturb her, and they talked a little about their grandchildren before ending the conversation. That evening, sitting in the house, Victor could not stop thinking about what he had answered to his daughter. What now? Maybe he fled here not to find answers, but to hide from pain and shame. Perhaps he was afraid that his life was ruined, and he would no longer be able to restore trust in his wife. There have not yet been clear answers to these questions. Spending the next few days alone, he did housework, exercised, took long walks along the lake, and sometimes even visited Paula and her children. He loved spending time with them. Their family seemed so happy and friendly. But even despite this, an empty, painful question remained inside him. Should he try to restore the marriage or leave forever? One day, after a long walk along the lake, Victor met Paula and her children again. He noticed them playing on the butt of water in a small inflatable boat. However, the game quickly turned dangerous. The boat capsized, and the children found themselves in cold water. Victor knew that the depth in that place was not too great, but the algae could entangle their legs, and this posed a danger. Without thinking, Victor rushed into the water to help. He grabbed Frank by the collar and pulled him to the shore, but Beth began to choke. Victor realized that her leg was entangled in seaweed. Taking a deep breath, he dove to free her. After several efforts, he finally pulled the girl to the surface and, together with Paula, who had already rushed into the water, brought her to the deck. Beth was shocked, but she was fine. Paula could not help but cry tears of gratitude. She held her daughter close and then hugged Victor tightly. "Thank you, Victor. You saved my daughter," she whispered, her eyes full of gratitude and relief. Victor felt the warmth of her body, and at that moment he felt truly good. There was something calming and even healing in this hug and her gratitude. He put his hands on her shoulders and pulled her towards him. The feeling of her plump breasts on his chest was pleasant, even very pleasant. "I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But right now, I think we all need to get some dry clothes. Otherwise, we'll freeze to death in these wet clothes," Victor said, reluctantly pulling away from her embrace. She was pleased, very pleased. She was his favorite girl. Paula instantly took command. "Come on, guys. Put your things in the car," she ordered. Then she turned to Victor and said, "You're coming home with us? You can share some of our clothes. Paula, my cabin is nearby and I can take a walk." He was stopped from finishing by Paula, who grabbed his hand and led him to their SUV. "By your own admission, it will take you 45 minutes to get to your house, and I will not allow you to walk around in these wet clothes for 45 minutes. Our house is only 15 minutes away, and you are driving there." "That's right, I'll be making dinner tonight, and I want you there," chirped Beth, who had already grabbed his other hand. It was nice to feel loved, to be truly loved. Victor felt a strange warmth in his heart for this family. They were all good. Paula's husband must have been a great guy, Victor thought. He made himself comfortable in the front passenger seat. The children quickly climbed into the back seat and Paula immediately took off. She drove as fast as she could in the forested surroundings, and they reached their hut in less than 15 minutes. Paula quickly ushered them inside. It was getting dark, and a cold wind was blowing. Unfortunately for Victor, they didn't have anything his size. In the end, he had to make do with a tight set of Speedos that belonged to Frank and a Mexican blanket to cover. By then, there was a good fire burning in Paula's fireplace. She put on a large t-shirt that reached her knees. They didn't have a TV connection, so the four spent their time talking to each other. Over time, Victor began to feel more and more comfortable in the Lehman family. Looking at them always brought back pleasant memories. As promised, Beth and her older brother prepared a wonderful dinner for them. Beth was delighted when Victor complimented her cooking skills. The children also became very open to him. Frank told him he wanted to join the S Navy as a naval pilot. Victor remembered that he had a distant relative in the S Navy and promised Frank that he would contact him and tell him how to prepare for the qualifying exams. Beth wanted to become a doctor, like her mother, or maybe a chef. Victor smiled affectionately. She was only 13, and she still had time to choose a profession. All this time, he felt a pair of eyes watching him closely. A couple of times, he even noticed Paula looking at him with a strange expression in her eyes. Finally, it was time for the children to go to bed, and they reluctantly left, but not before hugging him. Victor added more wood to the crackling fire and sat comfortably on the rug next to the fireplace to enjoy the warmth of the fire. Paula joined him with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "Fill the glasses, and I'll be right back," she said, placing the bottle next to him. It was obvious from the way the t-shirt hugged her figure that she wasn't wearing panties. Victor felt himself getting aroused in response to the female beauty in his immediate vicinity. A few minutes later, Paula returned with a very large blanket in her hands. The way her breasts were bouncing clearly indicated that she had ditched the bra for the rest of the evening. She covered him with a blanket and then covered him too. Victor was taken by surprise. She was in close proximity. Victor carefully adjusted the blanket before handing Paula her drink. If she leaned too far, things could get very awkward. As the drinks flowed, the conversation turned to her personal life. "What is a beautiful girl like you doing here in this wonderful forest? Alone?" Victor asked. He was curious, but had previously refrained from asking questions. But now, after a couple of drinks, the warmth of the fireplace, and their close proximity, the question seemed quite natural. Paula threw her head back and laughed before answering. Victor stared at her breasts, so clearly outlined in the glow of the fire. She looked so fresh, so motherly, so sexy. "No, Victor, it's not that I don't have fans, but I promised myself and Ron that I would take care of our children so that they would get into a good college before that happened. We had a dream, a common vision. We wanted our children to do well in school and then go on to some reputable college. Ron is not with us now, but I am here, and I am. I will do everything possible to make our dream come true." Paula answered quietly with a distant look, no doubt thinking about her deceased husband. She did not forget her husband, even after so many years, Victor thought. Her husband passed away, but she didn't forget the same goals they set for their family. He felt his feelings for her growing. This was a woman determined to live life on her own terms while his wife. Victor felt pain engulf his body again as images and clippings of his wife's infidelity began to replay in his mind again, threatening to ruin an otherwise perfect evening. He admired this woman who was determined to live by her own rules, while his own wife. Victor again felt pain engulf his body as images and memories of her betrayal surfaced in his mind. They began to flash through his head again, threatening to ruin this seemingly perfect evening. "Have you ever tried dating after your husband died?" Victor asked carefully. "Oh, Victor, like any woman, I also have my biological needs. I have friends with benefits, but I'm careful. I don't want to play with my children's feelings by bringing a man home. I prefer trips out of town. For everyone else, these are just work trips, although in reality, they are meetings with my friend. But I always return home alone, and it will be like this for some time," Paula answered seriously. "What if a man wants something serious?" Victor continued. "This happened to a guy I dated last year, but I explained to him that I wanted to first fulfill all my responsibilities to my family before committing myself to a man. The poor guy was very upset. I got the impression that he thought I just wanted to play and not build a serious relationship." Paula replied with a slight sadness in her voice. "How long has your wife been cheating on you?" Paula suddenly asked. The unexpectedness of this question stunned Victor, and it was immediately reflected on his face. "Am I really that transparent?" Victor asked, surprise written on his face. Paula laughed again, this time melodiously and cheerfully. "Don't forget, I'm a psychologist. I can read people's thoughts," she continued with a slight twinkle in her eyes. And then Victor himself did not notice how he began to tell Paula everything that was in his soul. He told her how he found out about his wife's infidelity after accidentally opening a package intended for her. He described his rage and disappointment when his wife refused to acknowledge her actions as a betrayal of their marriage, and his current state in which he could not decide what to do next. After all, despite everything, they had a happy marriage for 30 years. They were proud of their children who succeeded in life and were already enjoying grandchildren with a promise of more in the future. They had entered the golden age of life, and Victor never thought that he would have to face such a problem. "You love your wife, don't you?" Paula asked. "I love it, and I probably will always love you. Just how could she do this to us? I asked her if I was leaving her unsatisfied, and she always denied. If you believe her words, then why? Why did she have an affair with her boss? How many years did your wife work for him? 14, maybe 15 years. She started there when Kate started school and continued to work for him throughout her career in Dallas. And the affair took place during your last year living in Dallas, right? So it was in the 14th or 15th year. That's what she says. But like I said, I caught them a few times at parties at their house, standing too close to each other, whispering conspiratorially," Victor replied, his mind going back to the times he saw them together at the party. Harry, standing too close to each other in a dim corner of the patio, as if they were slightly rubbing against each other. "You say that she worked with Harry for almost 15 years, so it is only natural that they had many common topics of conversation related to the office and employees. Those whispers might not be as conspiratorial as you thought," Paula replied thoughtfully. "But those photographs and discs speak for themselves," Victor objected gloomily. "This is true, but she ended the affair as soon as you moved to Houston, and you never had any reason to doubt her fidelity or commitment to your marriage," Paula said calmly. Victor considered her words before answering. "Let's just say I had no reason to doubt her loyalty to Dallas, and look where we are now," he said bitterly. Paula nodded in agreement, placing her empty glass on the floor. The bottle was almost empty, and they were both pretty drunk. It was the wine and the atmosphere that forced Victor to open his soul to his new girlfriend. Now that his secrets had been spoken out loud, he felt relieved, as if he had been relieved of some of the burden on his conscience. Paula moved closer to him. It was cold outside, and the warmth of their bodies pressed against each other seemed especially pleasant. Look at it from her perspective. Perhaps she found closure in something she knew had gone too far and was threatening her marriage. And what would she get if she told you about this affair with her boss? She would only hurt you and destroy her family. Think about it from her point of view, Victor. She is not a serial cheater. Otherwise, it would never have been hidden. You're dealing with a one-time incident. Your wife knew him for over 10 years. Over such a period of time, trust and friendship probably developed. After Harry's wife died, perhaps she realized that he had lost something important, something that had eluded him in this new life. She could sympathize with him as a woman, seeing the pain of loneliness in a man, and tried to help him, perhaps going beyond what was acceptable. Paula stopped for a moment and looked closely at Victor to make sure he was listening to her. Once she was sure he was focused, she continued her professional analysis. "And so, Victor, your wife appears here. Besides his wife, she was one of the few people he had been closely associated with over the years. She knew his wife well, which made her special in his eyes, although he may not have realized it. But your wife's feminine intuition sensed a problem and a possible solution. And then, as you already know, everything happened. Silence reigned in the room, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the fireplace. Victor thought about Paula's words. He didn't like her professional rationalization, but he had to admit that he couldn't find any fault in it, especially considering that the woman in question did not herself believe that sleeping with another man for any possible good purpose was a violation of marriage vows. Listen, Victor, you make the final decision, but think about it. How much can a 6-inch piece of human flesh that ends up in the wrong place harm a marriage? Please don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to justify your wife's actions, but we can all make mistakes at work or while driving. But this does not mean that you need to condemn a person for life. The Lord has given us the power to forgive. Remember, no one is asking you to forget anything, but forgiveness is something we are capable of if we have the strength in our hearts and minds. And in your case, this strength will stem from the wonderful marriage that you and your wife were so happy with. You have 2 wonderful adult children, and you already have grandchildren. So think about everything I said before you make your final decision. Victor sat silently, He had no reason to believe that Vanessa had ever been unhappy or dissatisfied in their 30-year marriage, and he was sure that she was not a serial cheater. But he felt pain and humiliation. He remembered coming home from Houston and going to several parties where he also met Harry. This bastard never revealed that he was sleeping with his wife. He always greeted Victor as an old friend whom he had not seen for a long time. "I bet they just had sex before I arrived," Victor thought bitterly as anger set in again, trying to get the better of him. Victor recalled occasions when a famous general's mistress would appear at parties with her husband and be seen chatting with the general and his wife, as if they were just friends. Surely the general was internally laughing at her husband, remembering how he had sex with his wife. Victor thought, with a growing feeling of disgust. And Vanessa, what was she thinking when she saw him hanging out with Harry at those parties? Have you compared them, comparing sizes and their love techniques, becoming horny? Paula did not try to interfere and allowed Victor to struggle with his thoughts. She knew she had given him a lot to think about. She snuggled even closer to him and laid her head on his shoulder. Her right hand lay on his chest. "And Victor," she said quietly, trying to get his attention. "Yes, thank you for saving my daughter. It's nice to be around people who care," she continued, leaning closer and kissing him. Victor had not been intimate with a woman for a long time. He hasn't had sex with his wife since that unfortunate package was delivered to their home. During this time, he resorted to self-gratification several times, but from the moment he arrived at the hut, he led an almost reclusive life. He felt his body respond to her embrace. Their tongues met in a kiss and they hugged each other. Her body was soft and warm, so inviting. Victor felt his excitement growing. "Oh, Victor, you seem to find this mother of two quite attractive," she said playfully. I didn't mean to. Of course you're beautiful." Victor stuttered, trying to get out of the awkward situation he found himself in. Paula interrupted his explanation by pressing her lips to his again. Paula and Victor continued to hug, their lips touching gently, and there was a quiet intimacy between them. Paula touched his body lightly, slowly running her finger over his skin, barely touching, as if trying to feel every detail. Her hand moved carefully, slowly hugging. Paula exhaled quietly, her eyes remaining closed, and she enjoyed the moment, feeling the warmth of Victor next to her. Their kiss was soft but intense, their tongues barely touching each other as if in a tender game. Victor began to kiss her face first, a soft kiss on one cheek, then on the other. Each gesture was gentle and attentive. Her hand smoothly slid lower, touching his legs. Paula's movements were slow, as if she was exploring every inch, not in a hurry to get anywhere. Then she pulled back slightly and in one motion removed the blanket from him to feel more of his warmth. For a few moments Paula simply looked at him, her gaze filled with tenderness, and the light from the fire in the fireplace only enhanced the coziness of the moment. She took her time enjoying every moment of their intimacy, leaving space for everything to happen naturally. "Lie down," she whispered hoarsely, her voice betraying her excitement. "Paula, we shouldn't do this." "Hush, don't say another word," she replied, moving closer to him. "Do you like my breasts, Victor?" she asked seductively. "They fed my two babies with their precious milk," she continued, playfully touching herself. Victor moved closer, laid Paula on her back, and began to cover her body with kisses. She then began to push his head lower, making it clear what she wanted. Slowly, with deliberate slowness, Victor began to go down, caressing her. Victor tenderly slid his lips over her body, exploring every curve and corner, lingering where she reacted especially sensually. He touched her like he was teasing her, hinting at something more, but never crossing that fine line. Paula exhaled barely audibly. Her body responded to his every movement, as if she could not get enough of these caresses. "Do you like it?" he asked quietly, touching her so that she could not hold back a quiet, moaning sigh. "You can't even imagine how much," she answered, barely holding her breath. He was extremely careful. Every gesture, every touch was performed with such care that she felt every movement with her whole body. Her breathing became increasingly erratic. She was close to losing herself in this moment. He carefully changed his position, and she felt his presence nearby, so close that it seemed to her that her heart was ready to jump out of her chest. He took his time, creating tension, forcing her to breathe faster and deeper. "Please, I want." she whispered, her voice filled with tense anticipation. Victor also longed to have sex with her, but suddenly he began to doubt and ask himself questions. Doesn't that put me in the same boat as my cheating wife? Why am I going to have sex with another woman if my wife is waiting for me at home? In his youth, Victor met many attractive women as part of his work events. Some of them even showed interest in him and hinted at deeper relationships, but he never gave in. So why now? For revenge? Yes, this is exactly what is happening now. Is he going to humiliate and hurt his wife to get revenge by spending one night with Paula? But his wife had an affair that lasted almost a year, and it is unknown how long it would have lasted if they had not moved to Houston. What about Paula? She was a good woman and a wonderful mother. Was it right to use her as a tool to avenge her humiliation? Victor began to lose his excitement as he tried to deal with his inner demons. He noticed that Paula was looking at him with a question in her eyes. Paula, I'm sorry, but I'm a married man and I don't think that. That's all he could say before Paula pulled him towards her, pressing herself against him. There was a strange expression on her face. It's okay, Victor, I understand, she said, snuggling into his body and resting her head on his shoulder. They were silent for a while, just lying next to each other. Paula then rolled onto Victor and kissed him on the lips. Her soft, hot body pressed against his felt so good again. Victor hugged her, pressing her to him. They continued to hug each other for a while until Paula slowly began to move down, continuing to cover his body with light kisses. Victor sighed quietly with pleasure. She was skilled, very skilled. He got excited again. She just gave him pleasure. It's okay, honey, I understand, she whispered again before she fell asleep, throwing one leg over Victor and pressing her chest tightly against him. Victor lay motionless for several minutes. It was a busy day, and the evening was also full of events. He felt better, much better than he had in weeks. Why do I feel so relaxed when nothing has really changed? Victor thought, slowly running his hand up and down the naked back of the woman sleeping next to. He'd only known her for a couple of days, and here he was, sleeping with her. Yes, nothing has really changed. No matter how hard I try, I still can't ignore this elephant, trampling on my mind. His wife cheated on him with her boss, and he still couldn't understand why. According to the wife, it had nothing to do with their marriage. It was not an affair, but rather something like a healing touch. And besides, he still couldn't decide what to do next. Damn it, 30 years of marriage is a long time, and in these years there were many happy memories, and now a few bitter ones. The last thing Victor remembered before falling asleep were images of Paula making love to him. The next morning, they got up early and cleaned the room before the children woke up. By the time the children appeared in the kitchen, breakfast was already on the table, and Paula and Victor looked fresh and cheerful as if they had just taken a shower. Victor liked Paula's children, and the feeling was mutual. Beth sat next to him at breakfast and talked non-stop. It seemed like they had known each other their entire lives, not just a few days. Her brother would occasionally interrupt her with playful remarks, to which Beth would simply stick her tongue out at him and immediately return to her conversation with Victor. It was a very close-knit family, and perhaps the loss of their father brought them even closer together. Perhaps having a man in the house temporarily filled the void left by their father's death. Victor noticed how Paula glanced at him from time to time with a thoughtful expression on her face. The morning has come, and undoubtedly the psychologist in her has awakened again. Victor thought with a slight grin. In the end, it was decided that they would go to the lake in the morning rather than in the afternoon, so that Victor could then return to his hut. When they arrived at the lake, the teenagers immediately ran ahead, leaving Victor and Paula alone. They sat comfortably on the grass next to the stones, and Victor laid a blanket on the ground. He looked carefully at Paula, who was sitting next to him. She put on her headphones and listened to music on her Walkman, closing her eyes and bobbing her head to the music. She wore faded jeans and a simple white blouse that hugged her curves. She is smart, a good mother, and a very purposeful woman, Victor thought, watching in fascination as her chest rose and fell with the rhythm of her breathing. He felt his body respond to her femininity again. She was exactly the woman he liked, and his body clicked on it in the most natural way. Victor silently wished them all good luck. as he didn't think he would ever see them again after today. He planned to leave the next morning. He really made no progress in resolving issues in his personal life and decided that it would be better to return home. Victor. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he did not notice how Paula looked at him silently for a while. "Oh, sorry, Paula," Victor muttered. The woman was almost 20, years younger than him, and he had just been caught shamelessly looking at her breasts. "You didn't do anything I didn't want you to do, so stop apologizing." Paula replied with a mischievous smile. "Anyway, you've already seen and tasted what I have to offer," she continued, enjoying the discomfort she was causing Victor. "About last night, Paula, what happened? You are a good man, Victor, and by saving my daughter, your position in my mind and heart is now high above the clouds." Paula replied, cutting off whatever he was about to say. "And what happened last night was consensual. Sex between two people is the most natural way to show love and affection. Mother Nature made us this way, and no matter how hard we try, we can't fight it." Victor nodded his head in agreement, but the look on her face said she wasn't done yet. "You saved my daughter. Okay, you can protest and say the water wasn't that deep, but I'm a mother. And you were there for my child in her time of need, and what happened between us last night was, as I said, natural. Mother Nature made us such women. Well, you won't have to see me complaining. But being a married man, I shouldn't have taken advantage of your state of mind. Perhaps our drinks also played a role. You refused to have sex with me, and in doing so, you have more than kept your marriage. More than kept your marriage. More than kept your marriage. Va more than kept your marriage. Va more than kept